So I'd like to welcome everybody who's joining us on our live webcast. For those of you who are joining us on the webcast on YouTube, you're most welcome. We'll be beginning the event in about 5 minutes, so please be patient, and in about 5 minutes we will start the media launch.
Nature is being lost at rates never before seen in human history because we don't value nature enough in our policies, choices, and actions. The values that we individually ascribe to nature are vital parts of our cultures, identities, economies, and ways of life. But how can we reflect these multiple values in decisions about nature? On 11 July 2022, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services will help answer these questions with the planned release of the Ipus Assessment Report on the Diverse Values and Valuation of Nature. Prepared by more than 80 leading scientists and knowledge holders from every region of the world, the Ipus Values Assessment is the product of 4 years of work, drawing on more than 13,000 sources. It explores the different ways of valuing nature, how this can be measured, and how to integrate these values into decision-making. Ipus, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today, both in person here on the UN campus in Bonn, Germany, and also to everybody joining us online from around the world. My name is Rob Spall, and I lead communications for Ipus, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Welcome to this media launch of the Ipus Assessment Report on the Diverse Values and Valuation of Nature. To begin, I'm pleased to announce that the media embargo has now been lifted. A very special thanks to those of you online who may be joining us for the second time in just a few days, having also covered our media launch on Friday of the new Sustainable Use of Wild Species report. Before we continue, I'd like to just ask our media colleagues who are joining us online to please submit any questions you may have for our panel using the Zoom webinar question and answer function. That's the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function, as no questions posed in the chat will be answered. Please be sure to start any questions that you pose with your name and your media outlet, and then your question. A reminder, you can also follow us online, and this launch can be followed online using the social media hashtag #valuesassessment. That's all one word, #valuesassessment, and please do tag @Ipus in your posts. So to begin, I would like to introduce our speakers today, starting with our Executive Secretary of Ipus, Dr. Anne Laragadri. We are also very pleased to welcome to the podium our Chair of Ipus, Ana Maria Hernandez Salga, and the 4 co-chairs of the Ipus Values Assessment, Professor Patricia Belvanera, Dr. Brigitte Baptiste, Professor Unai Pascual, and joining us by video link today, Professor Mike Christie, who will be also online and with us via the Zoom video link. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our Ipus experts who are also joining us in the room today. Some of these are some of our coordinating lead authors of the report. Could each of you please raise a hand as I mention your name, just so that the journalist who's in the room with us can also identify who we're talking about. We have with us Drs. Rebecca Chaplin-Kramer, Arild Vatten, Mette Termanesen, Christopher Anderson, Chris Raymond, Adrian Martin, and David Barton. Thank you so much. I'd also like to introduce some of my media team who will be helping us today. We're joined by Mr. Terry Collins and Nadine Hoffman, who will be helping read out some of the webcast questions and will also be your points of contact should you wish to have any interviews with any of our experts. So to begin, I would like to invite the Executive Secretary of Ipus, Dr. Anne Laragadri, to take the floor. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. Greetings to all. We are live from Bonn, Germany, where the 9th session of the Ipus plenary just finished a couple of days ago, this past Saturday. It is a plenary that was attended by a little more than 900 registered participants, and that included representatives from the governments. Ipus has 139 members as governments as members, and Ipus also has a number of stakeholders who are interested in its work, and many were represented, many NGOs, many representatives of academic institutions, of indigenous people and local communities, of business in industry, among others. And we are very pleased, of course, that this past Saturday, the plenary approved the summary for policymakers of the values assessment and accepted its chapters following a line-by-line approval of the summary for policymakers and exchange between experts and governments. And of course, like all Ipus reports, the values assessment is directly relevant to policy. It was requested by governments. It was also requested by parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, among others. And in order to produce the assessment, Ipus has assembled a team of interdisciplinary experts from many disciplines of biodiversity science, and particularly from a diversity of social sciences discipline. It also has included indigenous and local knowledge, since, as always, Ipus has this guideline, this principle to involve a diversity of knowledge, including not only scientific knowledge, but also indigenous and local knowledge. So the report, the values assessment report, really builds on the Ipus global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which came out in 2019. And as you will recall, the Ipus global assessment concluded that nature and its contributions to people are being degraded at a rate and scale unprecedented in human history. That was particularly the case for the non-material contributions. We're talking here about the sense of place, of identity that is brought by nature. But there is also a loss of many of our regulating contributions, like the capacity of our ecosystems to pollinate our crops, or to regulate our climate, or the quality of our water. And both this non-material and these regulating contributions have been in decline over the past 50 years. The global assessment concluded that these losses occur because we fail to properly value them, and we fail to properly include them in our decision-making processes. So this assessment, the values assessment, addresses just that issue. It first explores the diversities of values attached to biodiversity, to nature around the world. It looks at how people across a diversity of regions, of contexts, of social contexts, have conceptualized the relationship between humans and between nature, and it proposes a typology of these values. It then looks at how to measure these values, and it also analyzes thousands of decision-making processes, looks at who was consulted to make those decisions, who was not, whose values were privileged, whose values were ignored, and what was the consequence of ignoring those values into the decision, but also into nature, on nature itself. And it is based on this analysis that it proposes then a toolbox, a set of principles, of guidelines, to then be better equipped to consider this diversity of values moving forward, and to make our decisions more relevant, and then with a better outcome for nature, which is what we are all after eventually. So it's a very ambitious report. It is very innovative. It has far-reaching consequences for the way we relate to nature, and it will contribute to informing the transformative change that is necessary to achieve many of our sustainable development goals. So I thank you in advance for your interest, for your questions, and we look forward very much to those. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you very much, Anne, for your remarks. We now turn to the presentation of the key findings and the messages and the evidence of the Ipus Values Assessment, which will be presented to us by two of the four co-chairs of the Ipus Values Assessment. And I believe the floor will first be addressed by Professor Unai Pascual. So Unai, you have the floor.
Thank you and welcome. So I'm going to try to briefly explain What have been some of the key findings, most important findings of our report? Then Professor Patti Valvanera will continue with some more information about the relevance of our report. We think that an overarching message that should be very clear, which stems from the evidence that we have gathered during these 4 years, is that the decisions based on a narrow set of market values of nature underpin the current global biodiversity crisis. This evidence is very strong, but at the same time, the evidence points at the fact that there are many opportunities to embed the diverse values of nature into decision-making to try to navigate well towards more just and sustainable futures. So these two messages are key, are broad, but very well supported by the evidence. In terms of more specific key messages, we know that every day, every minute, every second around the world, there are many economic and political decisions being made. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that all these political and economic decisions have predominantly prioritized market-based instrumental values of nature. So those values of nature that are key for people's livelihoods, sense of progress or well-being, needs. There are many demands on nature, but there are many other values of nature that are also needed, that do not go through the market and usually get sidelined. And this fact, this bias in decision-making, as we said before, is one of the key drivers of the current biodiversity crisis. It is the case that, as I said, many of nature's values are very often ignored in favor of short-term profits and economic growth. This is a very powerful driver of our current biodiversity crisis, and the values that underpin this need for profits and economic growth is at the core of the problem. Likewise, it is important to note, and this also comes from the evidence, that many conservation policies also risk downplaying the diverse values of nature. Usually, conservation policies focus on what we call the intrinsic values of nature, the values or the worth of nature for its own right. And sometimes, in different contexts, conservation policies disregard other instrumental values of nature, those values that really are important for local people's livelihoods. Therefore, the evidence also suggests that ignoring, excluding, or marginalizing local values tends to lead to socio-environmental conflicts around the world. And these conflicts are linked to the value clashes, especially in the context of uneven power relationships or power asymmetries in society, which in turn undermines the effectiveness of the environmental policies we tend to put in place to try to correct the problems that we're generating on nature. It follows, the evidence follows in our report telling us that achieving sustainable and just futures for all requires a recognition, but also the integration, the effective integration of the diversity of values of nature into political and economic decisions, those decisions that we are making every single minute, every single second around the world. There is also plenty of evidence in our report that points to the fact that recognizing the values of local people affected by decisions, by those political and economic decisions, tends to result in better outcomes, not only for people, but also for nature. The term value might be thought to be a fuzzy term, depending who we are, where we live, which knowledge we hold. We perceive nature in different ways, and therefore the way we value nature might look very different across people, across cultures. So another key finding, and there is evidence again to support very strongly that people value nature in very different ways, depending on their knowledge systems, languages, cultural traditions, and environmental context. This creates a challenge big challenge when decision makers talk about the need to understand or work with the values of nature or integrate values of nature into decisions. First, we need to know what we mean by the values of nature. Therefore, one very important outcome or output from this report is also to create a very clear map, a typology of all these very diverse values of nature. This is needed to really have a common language and bring this language into, or this common language into decisions, so we can really understand what we mean by that. The report looks at which are the worldviews that exist out there that determine the different values of nature that people hold. We differentiate between what we call broad values and specific values that also allow us to measure and have indications about the status and trends of these values. And we use various metaphors also to try to guide readers through this typology of values. One very interesting metaphor as a communication tool is to say that people live from nature. People also live with nature, in nature, and as nature. We will be very happy to explain what this means later in the Q&A. Once the typology of values has been created and allows us to have a common language and a common understanding about what these diverse values of nature are, the report goes and tries to understand what kinds of valuations have been undertaken around the globe. And it is very clear from the evidence that there is no shortage of methods and approaches to value nature. However, the uptake of these valuation methods and the values that could have arisen from using these methods remains very limited. In fact, the evidence points at the fact that less than 5% of published valuation studies report uptake in policymaking. As I said, we have a global coverage. We try to understand and point out where and how valuation has been undertaken in very different regions of the world. It is also clear, as the global assessment pointed out, that there is no way of having the needed transformational change if we really don't understand the values of nature and if we don't measure those. It is also quite clear, and this is also in our report, that transformative change needed to address the global biodiversity crisis relies on shifting away from certain values that emphasize short-term and individual material gains, and shift these values towards those that are more aligned with sustainability across social sectors. There are multiple pathways that could take us to a better world, a world where nature is protected and people benefit equally from those contributions from nature. The report does not tell countries or sectors which path to follow, but what it tells is that any pathway that might be followed is underpinned by specific values, and those values need to be understood. It also demonstrates that there are shared values across different potential pathways to get to the Sustainable Development Goals. And these shared values, for example, intergenerational justice or reciprocity, for example, allow us to be able to negotiate globally the best ways to try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But action is needed. We have to act. And we need to know how to act. Our report points at 4 different leverage points that are based on this lens, on the values lens. Actions that we can take to transform our socioeconomic policies, our decisions that we are taking every day that are harming nature and people. Very briefly, I will explain this. The first leverage point that is very clear, and this follows from what I've just said before, is that once this diversity of values is recognized, we have to measure those. We have to put them on the table transparently. We also have to bring those values into decisions. If we don't integrate those values into decisions, we won't be able to transform anything. Once decision makers realize that integrating these values is important and this starts to happen, it is very clear that many norms, rules, policies need to be transformed. Without the transformation of many policies, for example, perverse subsidies that harm nature and therefore also could harm people, we won't be able to transform to those desirable futures. And finally, but at the same time as the other action points are being tackled, it is important to shift our social goals and norms. Simple issues like how we define progress. This is important from a values perspective. We know that there are, for example, macroeconomic indicators that guide many economic policies and political policies, like, for example, the gross domestic product. The assessment also points at the need to move beyond this type of macroeconomic indicators because they are very poor indicators about the way our economic systems are creating benefits to people through the use of nature or cost to people through a misuse and misappropriation of nature. The report also points at a very practical fact that once we know all this and once the evidence is on the table, there are still many capacity needs around the world to be able to uptake and catalyze all these messages. So capacity building around the world and collaborations among a very wide range of stakeholders is needed. And if we do this, if we collaborate, if we have collective action around the shared sustainability aligned values, it is more possible, it is easier to be able to transform our socioeconomic and political decisions and systems in a way that they really address the current biodiversity crisis. And with that, I would like to give the word to my colleague and co-chair, Patti Valvanera, to talk about the expected impacts of our assessment.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. So, where can this assessment take us? So, the very direct impacts are at home within Ipus. As you know, there are two ongoing assessments and one assessment that will start on the ones that are going on are on the nexus, the connections between biodiversity, food, water, and health, and how these are interconnected, but also how to achieve transformative change. And there's another one on biodiversity and business. So all these insights will directly feed into the teams of experts that will already get these insights for getting forward. On the other hand, this assessment has an impact on many processes, global processes around biodiversity and around our shared visions for prosperity and for people and for nature. In particular, the targets and indicators of the 2050 vision for biodiversity are going to be discussed in Montreal at the end of this year. And the results from the assessment will illustrate and will help the delegates to refine the identification of these targets and indicators, and also to frame these discussions in the context of the role of values in promoting the transformative change and addressing the biodiversity crisis. Also, these results are directly linked to achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And also, sorry, I didn't say the other way around, the Future Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and this overall vision for biodiversity. Also, this assessment is really out there. It was negotiated with decision makers from the countries that participate in Ipus and that are part of the plenary. But this report has been also fed throughout all its process and can be useful to many other actors. And so we think that we truly believe that the findings of the assessment can really be used by voices around the world in different contexts, in terms of social actors, women, youth, indigenous peoples and local communities who are playing and can further play key roles in supporting the transformative changes needed to address the biodiversity and the sustainability crisis. To undertake this assessment, there was, over this 4-year process, we had 3 author meetings, one in Mexico, in the Basque Country, and online rounds of external reviews by everyone that could contribute, plus the governments. But also it's very important that this was all done in the context of the COVID-19 pandemics, requesting extra efforts from all our team. In particular, the engagements of indigenous peoples and local communities was extremely important and was managed by a liaison team, by different dialogues we held with these ILK experts in terms of identifying the guiding messages, a call for contributions, and their continuous feedback on with respect of the messages. And they actually were also invited as contributing authors. And this report is backed up by a very, very robust evidence with more than 13,000 documents deeply reviewed, and more than 200,000 pieces of evidence being screened. In total, if we could think about the efforts of all the team and all the people involved, this would at least be 19 years of in-kind voluntary contributions by more than 300 people, with experts, 95 experts nominated by Ipus, of which 18 are experts or holders of this indigenous knowledge, and from 47 countries. And we also had more than 200 contributing authors, 20 of which were directly indigenous local holders and or experts. We had a diverse expertise represented, and we had a management committee overseeing and strengthening the process, and a technical support unit that managed and supported all the work of this team that was based at the Institute for Ecosystem Sustainability Research at the National Autonomous of Mexico. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your interest, and we'll be more than happy to get your questions.
Thank you so much to both of our co-chairs who presented. I'd also like to thank all of the experts who've contributed to the Ipus Values Assessment over a 4-year period. I'd also like to correct an oversight on my part. I neglected to introduce one of our coordinating lead authors who's with us today, and my apologies. We're also joined by Dr. Sandra Jacobs, who's in the room as well. So my apologies, Sandra, it was an oversight. Before we open the floor to media questions, I would like to invite Ana Maria Hernandez Salgar, the chair of Ipus, to make a few final remarks as well. Ana Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's fantastic to take this opportunity to thank all the authors and the TSU who's also present, and a special recognition to our 4 co-chairs, Brigitte, Unai, Patty, and Mike, who is online. Thank you very much for this 4 years of tremendous work. You suffered, yeah, that is the word, suffered many challenges, and those challenges were not only in this dialogue between this transdisciplinary exercise that you had inside the authors community, but also because we had the COVID, and we had the problems with our jobs, in our professions, with a family that maybe didn't understand quite well why you had to be late at night or working during weekends, devoted to a work that is not paid work. So thank you very much to all of you for that. And also I take this opportunity to thank and to present my sincere appreciation to all the IPLCs and other knowledge holders which contributed greatly to this assessment. One of the most important contributions that I think I haven't witnessed it is that all of us have been learning to understand how different cultures with different expressions and approaches develop diverse methodologies to conceptualize the values of nature and its benefits. I think that it's important to highlight that there is no only one vision or one methodology to evaluate or to value our nature. We have to be humble, and I think that this is also a teaching from here. We have to be humble and recognize that we are building this knowledge in the base of the respect for different visions, for different views, and for different approaches to our dear nature. The guidance provided by the assessment will be of outstanding importance for decision makers to incorporate these diverse ways to understand the values. And I'm totally sure that doing that, they're going to be able to provide better decisions and to seek better pathways towards sustainability and the good quality of life. Finally, I want to thank the media present today, present here and present online. Your vital role and support in communicating Ipus messages to the general public and to decision makers is basic in the work, basic in not only in a communication point of view, but also because you are part of this bridge between science and decision making. You are our way to show the world what it means, the different work that we've done here. So thank you very much. And with this, I go back to you, Rob. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, for your kind remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the point in this launch where we will be opening the floor for questions from the media. We'll begin with a few rounds of questions from our online audience. As a reminder to journalists joining us online, please do submit your question using the Zoom webinar Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function. And please do start all of your questions with your name, the name of your media outlet, and then the question you would like to ask. So we have received a few questions already. The first question comes from Laura Swingewood from Enviro News. who asks, your report points to what you call a narrow set of values focused on economic growth as part of the reason for the biodiversity crisis. Given that the authorities in power today are prioritizing economic values, how much chance is there that the tools your report offers will be used and actually used by decision makers? So I'm going to ask which of our co-chairs would like to start. So Unai Pascual, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. This is a critical question. As the report makes very clear, and the journalist is correct, economic growth is one of the imperatives, it seems, and one of the underlying main reasons for the decisions, key decisions that we are taking that have tremendous impact on nature and people. But it is already a fact that during these days, 139 countries have endorsed the information and the evidence that this report provides. We know, and we have known this for a long time, and let me be very clear about this. This is not a new insight. We are building on many insights that have been brought around the world, that careless growth, growth for the sake of growth, creates many problems. This implies that we need to know in which ways growth needs to happen, whether it needs to happen, and where. I would like to give the word to Professor Aril Vatten, who has been also key to bring the evidence and to synthesize the evidence around this issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Unai. I think what we see when we study the history of how we have kind of created development over the last 70 years, we have, for many good reasons, emphasized economic growth. But the effect of that, which is very much documented in a lot of research that has been done over time, results in deterioration over environments. And in this situation, we have to think about both how we develop and how we take nature into account simultaneously. So when we make our policies concerning the development of societies, we shouldn't wait to see if there will be an environmental problem, because we know enough now to say that they will appear, and that we need to, in a sense, change our mind about how we integrate nature and nature values into decision-making up front.
Thank you so much to our experts for their answer. I'm going to ask my colleague Nadine if we have any questions from our online audience that she'd like to share with us. Nadine?
Yes, we do. Our first question is from Shushita Jha from Down to Earth in India. And she's asking, for so many years, human life has been disconnected from nature, though in some cases, like in India, rivers are worshipped, but even that has failed to help sustainable conservation efforts. How can policies and different approaches strengthen efforts to value nature and bring economic benefits for our sustainable coexistence with nature?
Thank you so much for that question. I'm going to ask Professor Patricia Belvanera to answer that. Patty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this great question. So indeed, we fully agree with you. And the metaphor we have in this report is about the different aspects that are emphasized in any people's lives, but sometimes some of these aspects are emphasized more than others, although they all occur. So for instance, exactly in the case of the river, the emphasis can be given in living from the river. So what we extract, like how many fish we extract. The emphasis can be in living in the river. So what is the relationship with respect to the river, to the place we live, to our well-being. We also can emphasize living in, sorry, it was in the river, now it's with the river, where we emphasize like the fish that live in the river and the right to exist, but also, as the example you showed, the living as the river, in which the river is fully connected to who we are and to our cultural background and all this sacredness that you're talking about. And so this has, we must, these different perspectives and let's say the emphasis on living as, on the sacred aspects of the river are being put forward, are still there, and in many places, people are fighting to make this visible. So what the values assessment is showing is how can we make this more visible? And there are very interesting examples in which actually we have a case study in India in which some of these values were made visible through different methods that can refer to the way people behave in nature, like for instance, undertaking these rituals, or how people talk about nature, so how they describe this connection with nature, but also a combination of all this information in terms of trying to identify how the different characteristics of this river in terms of the quality of the water or the fish are combined with the way people see the importance to their lives as of the river as a home, but also of the river as a sacred. So there are tools to combine all this in different ways, and I would like to give the floor to Sandra Jacobs to tell us a bit more about this.
Thank you, Patty. Yes, indeed. For each of these different types of values, there are methods available which can quantify or qualify these. And the key issue is indeed how to combine different methods and provide a more complete information to policymaking. We have been providing very incomplete information to policymaking because there was an emergency, because we needed to grow, because this was needed. But now we are seeing the effects of that. And the potential is there. The richness of valuation methods to achieve this is there. So we have these different types of values. We have described in the assessment 4 different method families, which are non-disciplinary. They go across all these different disciplines from economy, ecology, anthropology, and so on. And we have provided a 5-step protocol, a process as a guidance on how to determine which values are at stake, which people stakes do need to be included in the valuation process, and how to realize this until the integration to decision making. So we would hope that this can provide a good guidance for policymakers to realize this more complete information going into decisions.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you, Sander. We actually have a question that we also received, which I think relates to what you've just answered. So I'm going to ask that question as well. This is from Mark Franklin, who is a freelance journalist, who writes, "I'm not sure I fully understand your summary, but it seems the options you're pointing to for better decisions are to understand the different values that people hold for nature and to give those with different values a chance to be heard. But isn't that really cosmetic? Isn't it just more of what we've heard before, giving people a chance to feel heard, but then taking decisions based on values held by the people who make the decisions?" So a little bit more of a sort of a difficult type question. Brigitte Baptiste, perhaps you'd like to take that question for us. Brigitte, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the question, and it's glad to be here talking about this issue of cosmetic decisions that can be done and that have been done in the past related to biodiversity management or even valuation. The CBD has working hard to create and to raise awareness about biodiversity, and we have not fulfilled the task, and we are aware of that as well. And the issue is that perhaps we have not understood that the values are behind everything, are behind behavior, are behind our daily decisions, are behind our business opportunities. And now with the assessment, we can locate the relation between those values and the actions that the different actors on society can develop. So perhaps I can ask Chris to help us a bit. Chris Anderson, please help us.
Good afternoon. Often in the literature, this is referred to as the values action gap, where we can see the values exist, we know the values exist. In India, we have the case of sacred rivers, but the decisions don't correspond with the values. So precisely in the assessment, we identify the need for institutional changes. So we know the values there, but how is it expressed? That requires, among other things, dealing with power imbalances. And I'm originally from the United States, and I now live in Argentina. And I always recall a case where Martin Luther King met with President Johnson about civil rights change. And Johnson said, I agree with what you're saying, now make me do it. So we have to create the conditions. In this case, we're showing that the evidence is there, we're showing the methods are there. We create the political will and the social change that then politicians will have to agree, because we've now linked the values with the action, showing the pathways to do that through institutional change.
Thank you to you both. We're going to move to our next question online. Nadine, who's our next question from, and what's the question?
Our next question is from Jack Graham from the Thomas Reuters Foundation. And Jack is asking, we've seen limited innovative local examples of collaboration with communities and indigenous groups on the values of nature. But how can this be scaled up quickly, as quickly as the biodiversity crisis demands? Are there any methods that have promised to combine local input and scalability?
Patty, would you like to take that for us?
Yes, I will start, and then we can go maybe to methods and practice, and we'll see if maybe Becky wants to take it, and maybe complemented by Becky Chaplin-Kramer, but I'll get there. So indeed, in the assessment, we were able to identify some really successful stories. We show how, for example, different sectors collaborated in the protection of a wetland in Japan, and how being aware of the problem and really starting to share values about the importance of this wetland among different sectors that held different values, allowed them to start to take action together, which then was scaled up to other actors that were in the region. So there are many examples of these successes, and probably one major one of these initiatives at a much larger scale would be the big initiative, the One Health Initiative. The One Health Initiative that has been promoted by the United Nations and many intergovernmental bodies is a vision where you simultaneously leads with conservation of biodiversity, addressing the issue of the vectors of diseases, and also the conditions of life of people in terms of a healthy environment. And these initiatives are being agreed upon many different countries. In particular, we show that in the city of Singapore, there are very interesting developments that link the One Health in terms of addressing issues of health with issues of urban development and green spaces. But these ideas are being replicated, or at least are being taken up in different regions of the world, following these agreements to which a series of countries have committed to.
Thank you so much, Patty. I believe our fourth co-chair, Professor Michael Christie, who's joining us online, would also like to add to this. Mike, the floor is yours if you can hear us.
Hello, everyone. First of all, apologies for not being there. I've currently got COVID, so I'm stuck in my hotel room. Anyway, the question is, how can we get the local values and get them aggregated up to the larger scale? And there are two broad approaches to do this. One is aggregation, so you can look at the values of each individual and you can then aggregate them up to a total value. And this is what often happens in cost-benefit analysis. One of the issues with cost-benefit analysis or aggregation is it often gives more weight to more powerful actors and also larger groups. And so marginal groups maybe don't get heard as much. So another approach to addressing this is through deliberation, where you get different people affected by the issue, get them to have discussions about what's important to them, and develop some sort of shared value or shared vision. And that often helps to try and alleviate conflicts or potential conflicts. So there's two ways in which you can quickly get the local values and get them into the kind of larger scale decisions.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I believe we were also going to hear from one of our coordinating lead authors, Dr. Rebecca Chaplin-Kramer. Becky, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to return to this issue of having substantive involvement and local authority or autonomy. And we have some good examples of the case where when values are included and whatever methods are used in order to represent local values or values of local people and indigenous people in the process, having met with much better success and effectiveness in terms of both conservation outcomes and outcomes for people's good quality of life. And we have some great examples, having reviewed a number of case studies from around the world in protected areas, payments for ecosystem services, sustainable certification programs, and infrastructure development, as well as hundreds of peer-reviewed studies and synthetic reviews, really demonstrating this case that I think is emblematic in the Ulithi Atoll in Micronesia, as well as Raja Ampat Marine Reserve in New Guinea. Both of these showing really how much the local autonomy, not just the values being expressed, but their participation moving beyond the initial values process into the management and design of those decisions. So it really is a substantive cooperation between decision makers and local people. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our experts for their answers. Nadine, do we have more questions from our online audience?
Yes, the next question is from Hassan Isan Masoud from Nature magazine. And the question is, what is the most important message for researchers, especially in the science community, from this assessment?
Unai, would you like to take that for us?
Thank you, Rob. Yes, so there are many important messages for the scientific community. I will provide one or two, and I will let others also accompany me in bringing up a few other key messages. One is valuation, or uncovering or eliciting values about nature, or why nature is relevant for people, in which ways it is relevant for people. Might have or might be associated with two main questions. One is a kind of an intrinsic desire to know. Okay, this is what drives a lot of the science. We want to know. Okay, whether this knowledge will make it into decisions at some point, well, we don't know, but we need to know. Okay, so a lot of the scientific community is driven by this desire, this love for knowledge. Okay? And there are multiple studies about the values of nature and how nature valuation is done for this desire. There are other types of scientists who think that their science needs to be directly relevant to some kind of decision, usually in the short term, because they see that there's a problem that needs to be sorted, and they use their knowledge, their resources, their best know-how to try to improve decision making. So it's the practical side of science. I think both are relevant, both should be used, but in the context, in a context of urgency, in a context where biodiversity is being lost at an unprecedented rate, the context where this loss is associated with the climate crisis, we need to build coalitions of scientists from different disciplines to try to help address key and urgent and tangible problems. Moreover, science needs other allies. We need to be humble. Science reaches what it can reach. We have fantastic methods, fantastic frameworks, fantastic minds around the world who apply science. But science has some limits. And those boundaries can be expanded if we include other knowledge systems as well. If there is humbleness in science to invite other visions, other ways of knowing, other ways of measuring, and I think that this coalition among different knowledge systems is what could provide a kind of solution-oriented research approach to the coupled crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. To me, this is what we've learned from this assessment, and I invite any other
I believe
colleague
Patty would like to add something.
to add something to this.
Thank you so much, Unai. Patty, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Nasud. This is an excellent question. And I think for me, what I would like to say is I would like to highlight the very unique opportunity that Ipus is providing to advance a way of doing science that is directly linked to actual problems, to concrete demands by the governments that goes hand in hand with what representatives of the countries need. And we actually negotiated every paragraph of the summary for policy makers in terms of fine-tune the wording and make sure that this was made relevant to decisions in the final round. But we worked hand in hand with governments, NGOs, even some businesses and so on throughout the development of this report to incorporate this perspective. So it's a unique opportunity of bringing together people from all over the world, from all these different disciplines, these different knowledge systems, and to have these mechanisms to hear from the different stakeholders and that will be using this document. But also beyond this opportunity, we do think that it is very important to provide a fertile ground for the communication among individuals who are trained in different disciplines, who live in different countries, or who see the problem from different perspectives, cannot just happen because of intellectual exercise. It is really about individuals who are connecting and really laying. It's very important to build an environment of trust, of being able to listen and deep respect, and to be able to share very deep insights in order to really think beyond of what has already been said and have a very different perspective of the key issues and also the key tools to address the biodiversity crisis.
Thank you so much, Patty. I believe we have a question from in the room, a journalist who's joined us, Urmi Goswami from the Economic Times of India. Urmi, the floor is yours. Just push the button, the red button.
Okay, thank you. If you're looking at developing countries, their overriding goal is to ensure development and pull people out of poverty. And in that context, then if you're looking at nature, aspects of nature where you can assign an economic value need to be incorporated, all right, and that's probably an easier lift. But what about aspects of nature where an economic value is difficult? So suppose cultural or sacred values. And if you're in a democracy, then basically the political aspect of it becomes stronger because that becomes, there is a different sort of power play at work, and it can again create an imbalance. So I'm wondering, how do we actually work towards putting a value to an economic, I mean, ultimately you have to put an economic value. So how do we put an economic value on supposedly more intrinsic aspects of nature or cultural, social? Thank you.
Unai, would you like to take that for us?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. It's a very relevant question. It's a question that happens, that is asked many times. What we show in our report is that we don't need to force specific methods to try to find any kind of value. There are different methods for different to uncover different values. In the case of economic methods, yes, there are many economic methods. They are being applied a lot. We think that doing good economic valuation is a necessary step to take good economic decisions, but it's not sufficient. Okay, so it's necessary but not sufficient. Now the question is, how do we account for those other types of values? And once they are accounted, or once they are elicited, or once we know more or less how they look like, how we bring them together. It is the case that sometimes it's very difficult to bring very different types of values together. It's not like putting them in a box or in a computer software, hitting the button which says return, and somehow magically we get a result. It never happens like that. So valuation methods, although technical, and they can all the methods can give us some answers, and as Jacob Sanders has told us before, there's the possibility to combine different methods to have a better picture of all these values at stake. What we need to create is a process, it's a decision-making process that is transparent. Okay, it's a transparent process that shows what are all these different values and how all these values are taken into account. Again, this process is not just technical. Methods can help us to get there, but the final way of managing all those values that are sometimes are very hard to compare to each other is a political process. I would say political with big letters. Political, not in the sense that it's politicians that need to take this decision, is all the actors together have to find a way to agree how to compare these values, how to rank them, understand what are the trade-offs involved in prioritizing certain values against other values, who gets the benefits, who gets the burdens of those types of decisions. And this is something that the values assessment has provided guidance of how to do this.
Thank you, Unai.
Sander, maybe you would like to mention something more on the evaluation side of this, how to compare different values?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, and we had the DEEP report, which some years ago was a milestone for valuation, as it has achieved in bringing a lot of values that weren't calculated in economic valuations into these economic valuations. So many different things that were not part of the political considerations were put into euros or dollars, so to say, to influence decisions that are based on economic valuation. This report takes another big leap forward by introducing the fact that it's not only economic indicators, but it's also biophysical indicators, for instance, number of species, and also cultural indicators, for instance, the presence of sacred sites, which can be influencing decision makers directly without the need for being turned into dollars or euros, which can be damaging. So, and this is why we have this 5-step process, which, as Unai said, it redefines valuation from a technical method to everything that is around the method, from scoping, deciding who is involved, deciding which values are in or which values are out regarding the decision, until the integration of these different indicators in decisions. So what our report advances and compared to previous advances in valuation of nature is that we introduce different indicators, diverse indicators into decision-making directly without the need to turn them into euros or dollars or whatever kind of monetary units as an obligation.
Thank you so much. I believe we have some more questions. Nadine, would you like to ask the next question for us?
Yes, the next question is from Vipa Varshni from Down to Earth magazine in India. And the question is, has the report identified ways for communities that have protected biodiversity sustainably to receive monetary benefits?
Brigitte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, there's many examples that were provided by the indigenous peoples and local communities. They heavily participated into the build-up of this report, and we also acknowledge the many contributions that they have made towards this discussion. In many occasions, those communities don't have even a separated notion of nature, so they deserve to be understood in their own ways, and that's why the report acknowledges in many places their specific contribution and the difficulty to compare and to put the indigenous local knowledge and on the same weight than other stakeholders. And you'll see through the report lots of colors that show where do we think that understanding their contributions are important. But yes, the examples are quite important. For example, in the Living in Harmony with Nature initiative that it's already being created by the United Nations General Assembly, which invites all countries to report on the advancement of different types of negotiation with the indigenous groups and how they are evolving, how it's considered, how they are part of the governance process. And I don't know who can help us.
Before we move to one of our CLAs, I just want to point out part of the question was specifically whether or not there were ways of generating monetary incomes for local and indigenous communities that were conserving nature sustainably. So I don't know if any of our CLAs or anybody else on the co-chairs would like to focus on that issue for us specifically. Becky, would you perhaps like to take the floor?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think both sustainability certification and payments for ecosystem services are great mechanisms that, when designed with local input so that they can be successful and actually understand the local context on the ground, the realities that the producers are facing, those can be very successful instruments. But I also want to point out both of those examples have shown that it's not just getting paid that is the only thing that people need. It can also provide a lot of technical assistance, a lot of social and institutional support, help form better networks, cross regional networks of producers to sort of strengthen their own local institutions. And so I just think we have to keep an open mind about what might be the proper incentives to protect nature. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Nadine, our next question, please.
Yes, our next question is from Busani Bafana from Interpress Service. And the question is, why is it important to measure the values of nature? And were you able to agree on effective ways to measure the value of nature?
So we also had a different question, so I'm going to add to Busani's question as well, which was, this was from Esther Phillips from Open Access, who asked, can all values be measured, and should they be? And if they're not measured, is it realistic that the ones that are not measured would be included in decisions similar to those that are measured? So Patty, would you like to kick us off on that?
Yes, thank you very much for these great questions. So why should we value nature, right? So this is tightly linked to how we see the world and our link to nature, and then what are we going to measure and for what reason. So let's go back to this idea of the river. So if I think about a river from this metaphor of living from, in a way, I am seeing the river as a factory of food, of products that I can use for myself or to sell or for a supply chain. And so from that perspective, what I measure about nature what has been most predominant was to measure the output, how much fish are obtained, and what is the market value, what is the price in the market, and how much, at what price I can sell, for instance, this fish. What has much less been measured is how did these fish even get here, right? So how is it how did we get a river here? How is it that the river is clean, that the fish are growing well, are of a particular species that is useful? And this is starts to shift a bit the idea of saying, okay, I'm living from this river and from the fish, but I'm also living with the processes of that have happened on Earth and that have given the rise to the presence of these rivers and that regulate all these different functions in the river, and also the fish fish are there. So in a way, we have to measure, like if we're thinking of a supply chain, we have to measure where these things come from, but also we have to measure what is the context, where is this fish, this factory, for instance, sitting, what are the conditions in which it functions. So living in has a bit to do with, it's not even the metaphor of the factory anymore. That we can move to a metaphor of nature as the place where I live. So when you're in your house, what the attributes you would get to your house is not how much every part of the house is worth. You already paid it for some reason, it's already there. But what's important to you is whether the house allows you to be happy in the house, to have enough sun, to be comfy, to be at the right temperature, to really feel protected. But also, if we change also the metaphor, instead of thinking of a house, if we really think of nature as the world around us, of all these living beings that are around us, then we start valuing who is with us sharing this planet. And so we need to share who is we sharing with, how they function, but also if we then connect to the way that we every day are totally connected to all this nature around us, and we are really part of this world, and we cannot be easily separated to the air we breathe, the food we eat, to what is around us. And if we think about Earth as my family, as part of me, then you wouldn't measure what is my husband giving me, how much
Thank you,
money?
Patty.
No?
Yeah, thank you so
How
much.
much money that my husband is giving is how much I am caring for my husband to be happy, and are we caring together adequately for our kids? So there's so very different values that we measure depending on our mind frame, and they are measured in very different ways. And with respect to the last question, also, there's definitely methods for measuring all those, but of course, methods and measure need to be understood in a very different way. I'm not measuring how much I love my husband or how much he loves me. It's more about how we behave, how it really connects to who I am. So the way we think about measure or making visible is of a very different nature.
Thank you so much, Patty. I believe we have another question from online. Nadine, please.
Yes, the next question is from Julius Iseku from the Tekama Media Agency in Uganda. And I'm paraphrasing slightly, and it actually has two parts. The first part is, how can Ipus encourage African governments to incorporate the values of nature in conservation policies and to realize ecosystem and biodiversity goals while ensuring rights of the local people are protected at all times? And then if I may also read the second part already is more general, how does a country nation or nation become a member of Ipus? Is this on a voluntary basis?
So some rather Ipus specific questions. I think perhaps our Executive Secretary, Anne Laragadri, might be good to answer those as well. Anne, the floor is yours.
Yes, so IBES can encourage governments in Africa or in other places really by including them, by engaging them in its work. And so I believe that Uganda is a member of IBES, so Uganda would have been involved already in all of the life of the assessment, nominating experts, reviewing, and therefore having a chance to really be aware of all of the issues that are addressed in the report, and by becoming familiar with it. But in addition to that, when a report is completed, we then have a number of events that relate to policy support, but also to capacity building, where we organize dialogues between our experts and national focal points in particular, but other stakeholders in various countries in Africa, including Africa, of course. That's a major focus where we go, we explain our conclusions, and we then have dialogues on how to really concretely apply these findings to different contexts, in particular at the national and at the subnational level. So that would be a way to encourage our members to really put our findings into practice. And then when it comes to becoming members, again, I said I believe in that particular case that the country Uganda is a member, but in general, it is very easy to become a member. There are no conditions to it. It really is enough to signal the fact that the country, an official from the country would want to become a member, and then that's something that gets afterwards done relatively quickly. We have 139 members. We want to have all members, all countries members, and so that is something that we try to achieve.
Thank you very much, Anne. I believe Professor Mike Christie online was also hoping to contribute to this answer. So Mike, if you can hear us, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks again. One of the key messages from our report is that a focus on a narrow set of values leads to unsustainable outcome. And to a certain extent, we've talked about a narrow focus on economic growth, but we can also have a narrow focus on conservation. So often we've seen in Africa, if the focus is solely on the intrinsic values of nature, and that may restrict some of the activities of local communities. So we have to be careful and mindful not to do that. So how can we address it? So I think we've talked about indigenous and local knowledge, and we need to look at different methods and approaches to try and capture those different local values. And our assessment provides a whole range of tools to identify those values and capture those values. And I think what is really important here is that our assessment has been approved by 140 different countries. And what that is effectively doing is legitimizing those values and those knowledges of local communities in Africa and other developing countries. It legitimizes the methodologies that can be used to assess those values. So when it comes to those international discussions, say, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity in December, I think this report will really empower countries in Africa and the other global south to use the evidence they have about the impacts on local communities and use that in the discussions to try and come to international agreements for a fairer distribution of resources to protect nature and the rights of people in Africa.
Thank you so much, Mike. Great contribution. So I have an additional question that we received by email, and I'm going to pose this to all of our coordinating lead authors, with apologies to our co-chairs. I'm going to let the coordinating lead authors answer this one. So this was from Jean Richard from a freelancer who asks, Ipus's reports are meant to be informing policy. What is the single most important specific change in policy around the world based on your report that would have the most positive impact for nature and people? do we have somebody from our CLA group, our coordinating lead author group, who can talk about what specific policy change globally would have the most positive impact for nature and people based on the report? Any of our coordinating lead authors want to take that one for us? Please do.
Well,
please take your mask off so we can hear you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you for a great and maybe the most difficult question. And I'd have to choose from a list of favorites. But maybe at the top of my list, if I think about it, would be the report endorses policy facts and language about the diversity of values in a way that validates, empowers, and legitimizes work that's already ongoing by the representatives of local communities and indigenous communities and civil society and all of those who are working to represent their values. And so I think that, or my wish is that this report would lead to a movement to reform environmental impact assessment and to formally recognize this diversity. And I think that the way this values typology is now policy fact, by the very fact that it's been approved in the Ipus setting, could provide the basis for a reform of environmental impact assessment around the world. I think maybe that's my favorite.
Thank you so much. That's a great praise. I see more of our CLAs wanting to get in on this. Christopher Anderson, please.
I would say one of the main findings is that a lot of values, a lot of policies that engage values want to change values or form values. But a key finding here is also that a lot of latent values already exist. And so we shouldn't only think about awareness raising or campaigns to change people, but also allow the existing values that are there to express themselves through institutional change, for example.
Thank you so much. And I think I saw, was there an additional request for the floor, please?
Yes, and added to that, certainly there are a lot of values that are underpinning the existing institutional structures, and I think it's very important to become aware of those and how they work, and make explicit for the political process how we can change this. I think there are important lessons from the report, but also that we are, in a sense, I think, shifting a little bit the debate from thinking about economic development and environmental protection as kind of in a win-win setting, and learning and understanding that we rather face important trade-offs. And that, I think, can shift the debate. Certainly, it makes it more difficult. But since we understand it from that perspective, we can also be much more productive in producing sustainable futures.
Thank you so much. And I saw Dr. Rebecca Chapman-Kramer also would like to take the floor. Becky, please.
Thank you. Yeah, just to bring back something that really struck me about the plenary. We talked a lot about the human rights and the rights of nature and of Mother Earth. And I think it would be beautiful to see a UN declaration on the rights of nature and of Mother Earth, and maybe to recognize that human rights should include rights to have your values of nature recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. And Dr. Sander Jacobs, please.
Yeah, thank you. To add to the wish list. So from a methodological point of view, I think a careful reading actually, this report provides a new gold standard for valuation. So my hope would be that narrow, single method, whether it's economic methods or ecological methods or other methods, single method valuations would become illegitimate. They would not be considered as legitimate by politicians, but also by the public and by NGOs. They would no longer be accepted. And there would be kind of a new culture, a new standard of multi-method, diverse valuation.
Thank you so much. I think that's always great when you ask people who've spent 4 years writing a report what the one policy they'd like to see changed because of the report is. You're going to get a lot of answers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the close of this session. I believe we have one final question from our online audience. Nadine?
Yes, we got a question submitted by email from Daniela Chiaretti from Valor Econômico in Brazil, and she was having some connection issues, so she sent it by email. And the question is, how can this report help the discussions and the debate around indicators that is happening on the CBD debate for COP15?
So a question around whether or not the report and how the report might help the Convention on Biological Diversity's discussions for later this year for COP15 around indicators specifically. Christopher Anderson, would you like to take that for us?
We did a review of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans that are developed by countries that are members of the CBD. And there is a general recognition of the diverse values of nature. The CBD recognizes that nature means many things, but when you actually look at the indicators, there's mostly ecological and economic. So precisely what we're talking about here is incorporating social, cultural, and relational values to that box, that toolbox, as Sanders said, so that there's more legitimate and inclusive valuations.
Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the question and answers session and also to the end of this media launch event. Before we close, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their participation and also all of our experts, those who are here, and all of the hundreds of experts who can't be here in person for their incredible work over the last 4 years, their investment and of their time, their expertise and their energy into this Ipus values assessment. If you would like, if you're online, if you'd like to arrange any particular media interviews or follow-ups, please do email media@ipbes.net. And finally, a big thank you to everybody who joined us here today, either in person or on the webcast. This launch really is the culmination of 4 years of work, but it's not the end. It's the beginning of the impact of this report, hopefully on policy, on decisions, and on actions for nature. So thank you all again, and with that, we conclude this media launch event. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.